In Western Europe, again, this immigration question uh, becomes highly contentious because, again, as these colonies are uh, disintegrating in terms of power, the Western powers having control over them, again, you have this large influx um, of immigrants. These immigrants, though, often have passports for the mother country. So, for example, you could be from Trinidad and be a British passport holder, but you were born in um, a Commonwealth country. Now it becomes really hard. Now, what do you do with these people who legally have British citizenship and are going to, uh, the homeland of Great Britain itself, but then they're not being welcome and they're faced with discriminatory practices by employers in other such places. And in the early 1960s, the rhetoric against these people really takes a new height, and laws are passed that creates a special status or a different status between a British passport holder from, say, somewhere in Africa and a British passport holder, someone who was born in Great Britain. And there are obviously going to be multiple human rights violations during this time period because of this. And there are pressures from the right, from conservative parties, far right parties, who start protesting against immigrants. And Enoch Powell in 1962 becomes the emerging leader of this movement. And his policies and his stance is blatantly racist. And he invokes imagery that many people would compare to Hitler's rhetoric against the Jews. And there's quite a bit of support for this policy. And oftentimes in the 1960s, Europeans will look at their society and say, well, there's no racism here. That's something that happens in places like the U.S. But sociological studies of the time period show that racism was part and parcel of these societies, and beginning with these different class statuses and such for passport holders. Eventually, as I said, though, these people will integrate more successfully into these societies. It takes time, though, 10, 20 years, and sometimes it's a merging of cultures that happen, and this often starts with food, and you start to see Frenchmen dining in North African restaurants, and the British having a new taste for food from India and Pakistan. And these are the first steps of this kind of cultural assimilation. How do you bring these people in and form a new society? And like I said, this is a major discussion that was happening then, and it is today. But it's different immigrants that the targeting in Europe happens. In Germany today, in Austria, and in other parts of Europe, there's a lot of anti-Moroccan or anti-Turkish posturing that goes on, and oftentimes this is inflamed by religious tensions between these peoples. And every time there's a downturn in production or in the economy, then the immigrants are targeted as the cause of job loss and such. In Netherlands today, for example, there's a huge anti-Moroccan contingency really within society. In Germany, it's anti-Turkish. In places like Finland, which you wouldn't believe, but there's an anti-Somalian effort. Somalians were welcomed in the 80s, and these people have not integrated as fast as some people believe would have happened. But in the 60s, again, there's turmoil on various levels. And let me talk a little bit about um, kind of the social climate and the intellectual climate of the 50s and 60s. Um, a movement comes out of France in the 1950s, the existentialist movement. Maybe you've heard of existentialism. Um, mentioned in brief, or maybe in a philosophy class or something. And existentialism is was led by people like some writers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus and Simone de Beauvoir, and much of this is centered around that there's no longer a belief in things like ideological political beliefs like fascism or socialism. Those things are set aside. There's no longer a belief in religion and religious practices. That kind of traditionalism is put aside. So what is existentialism is man in or woman in a universe in which there is no inherent beliefs, and that you must make your own world in your own image in many ways. And this was often accompanied with this idea of boredom and angst that you have when you have this full realization that the only thing that you understand or that you know is that you exist, and there's nothing else. There's no faith, belief, there's no ideology. All these things are seen as illusions. And existentialism is a powerful movement that helps spark other intellectual changes and approaches to especially the social sciences. And traditional narratives of history are put aside, and there's a new look at history. There's a new look at ourselves as people and individuals. And this rejection of this old world is heightened in the 60s, and not only in the US, but in Europe as well. And in France, it really reaches a peak in 68. As I mentioned earlier about student riots, the students' riots end up turning into a much broader generational conflict, and also maybe a sociological conflict between the old and the new. France was being led by Charles de Gaulle, who had led the resistance in France against the Nazis, and he was in power since the end of World War II for many, many years. And much of this goes against de Gaulle in 1968, the original student protesters and what was happening. And they're going to resist the old world French ideas of themselves, which was traditional and patriotic, and they're looking for a more broader approach, and that includes part of the sexual revolution. Women's rights movement is happening in places like France, and there's a new push for equality and for just general human rights. And that becomes the new order versus that old traditional French society. And again, the immigrants that were once rejected, however, are then seen in a more inclusive format in the late 60s. And there's an appeal or of things from the East. And this happens throughout Western society in many different ways. But you see, for example, the Beatles going to India. And that's very symbolic of what is happening in Europe, because they didn't have to go to India. India was there already. India was in Britain itself. But it's this sense that there can be this cultural communication going on. And French musicians start to explore African beats. And, the British, like, for example, the Beatles are in India, and George Harrison is playing the sitar. And there's this emergence that there's this global or world society, and that there can be a sharing of ideas, and again an expression of human rights being universal. And there's a rejection in Britain, for example, by many people in the young, that Britain is only for white people, and that they can be more inclusive and embrace the people that have come from the former colonies. And so 1968 is a watershed moment, really, in French society. The student protesters end up becomes a national strike. Over 10 million people go on strike in 68. And although after the elections in June of 1968 kind of still support de Gaulle's government, there's a feeling that change has come to French society, and that old world, old order is finally rejected.